Hello, I'm Eugene.
And I'm Chris.
And we are the co founders and facilitators of a project called Courage to Look. And this is part of our podcast video series, Deepening the Conversation. We're here today with our guest, Catherine, and we're looking forward to a very engaged conversation between the three of us.
And what we're talking about is the history of racism in America. So, welcome, Catherine. We were just talking a little bit ago, and I want to throw out this whole concept of, because we've been doing a sort of exercise among ourselves, this whole concept of uh, opening up a conversation on BLM or on border issues or anything that is a national concern or communal concern with people that we normally don't talk to about these things. And how do we go about doing that?
Well, definitely with patience. It's important to be mindful that even whether someone is deeply conservative or progressive and very aware of these issues, that there's a lot of deep emotional charge to speaking about this. So if the intention is to potentially educate or at least get to a better sense of understanding about where the other person is coming from, it's important to be really patient and to provide some type of cues to the other person to allow them to speak. Allow them to speak. Hopefully, they don't take that invitation to speak as a mark to say something that would be unsettling. But I would think if we do have these conversations with people, we know that there will at least be some type of respect that would be implied that would make the conversation a little bit easier for both sides.
Yes, I want to add, I'll just say hi, I'm Catherine. And I think one of the themes we've been sharing is sometimes it's easier to start the conversations where there's a friendly reception. And I think for a first step, I find that's helpful for my own sort of courage, courage to look and to just get comfortable and sort of start the flow of having those conversations. And one of those is doing the course and doing the study. Having more of those conversations with myself, and it's becoming sort of more normal to have those conversations with other people. And I feel like I'm building up to some of the more uncomfortable ones, and the ones where, as a as a white person talking to other white people, sometimes where it's going to be a little bit rockier. Uh, Learning how to do that sort of in baby steps and just building up my own sort of sense of myself within that.
It brings up for me a question. It kind of begs a question for me, which is unless I'm in a situation, for example, like in a mock jury or a research trial in which there's a lot of pre-screening, in the majority of my social situations, um, either before COVID or during COVID virtually, I find myself again and again in groups of people where I'm still in the minority, and um, it's just not a question that I feel comfortable asking. And to whom do you ask that question? Because some of these events and whatnot are larger than ourselves. Usually, sort of like the lone wolf saying, "How come I'm the only I'm the only BIPOC person in this group that usually doesn't offer that opportunity." Uh, but I think it's a very good question to ask how that part of the conversation gets asked to appropriate sources or appropriate people who are in the organization.
Yeah, I find as a BIPOC, those moments where you're in a mostly white space and there's an opportunity to share. Someone talks about race. It's a delicate balance. You want to be authentic and speak from your heart, or as you truly think. And of course, there's this some kind of anxiety. I don't know if that's just conditioning in our society, based on what we hear in the press or our own personal experiences. But and then it's also difficult to find sometimes someone who's white, that's progressive enough to really have a full conversation. I grew up in St. Louis, and so um, the church I attended was it's about half white. It was an integrated church, but there were a number of conservatives there. So sometimes when conversations of race came up, it was kind of it was a very tense situation. But that being said, I just wanted to ask everyone, like, when we have these conversations, what should our objective be? Should it just be to educate, or just to have our voice be heard? To give validation for our voice. Like, what are usually your expectations for having these conversations?
Well, I think for me, it's evolving, and I think this course is helping me with that confidence, like, because I think an early, like, when something would come up, because I am also from St. Louis, and in my family there's a very Midwestern, you don't talk about anything deep, and if something's uncomfortable, you're not going to touch it, you're going to move away. So I think even if as I've held progressive values and anti-racist views, I've not always spoken up. So for me, what I'm looking for, and what I also think goes better, like if I go to educate or talk from a space of as if I know better. I think it's better when I speak from my vulnerability and try to find an opening with the other person, some point of connection, and then go from there. And maybe then it can be a little bit more educational. But just it feels like without some sort of human basic level connection, nothing really happens. If I don't open up, then it's goes nowhere.
That's a very interesting topic about the question of education versus speaking up versus voicing one's own personal experience, and probably a myriad of things in between that. It reminds me of a situation where I was in an annual social gathering a number of years ago, maybe 8 years ago, where the person that was sitting in the front of the room was talking about the need for more representation of BIPOC folk. And then there was like a little bit of a buzz of an excitement about that topic was brought up, and I don't believe that topic was ever brought up before. And then I'm sure some coming from a well-meaning place in their heart, some person voiced up, "Yeah, where are they?" And there were 3 of us sitting in the room of 100 people, and I was like, uh, and yet one person who was in the room, was also in the minority, said after the stunned silence, "We're right here." And the room fell silent for like a minute, a very painful, uncomfortable minute. And so it's like finding that, am I here to speak for myself? Am I here to educate? Am I in this conversation to just open it up, or is there another middle ground in between any of those? It's very tricky.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Eugene. It was very, I imagine, very difficult and isolating to have experienced that. When you heard the other person speak up, help? Did that help you feel a connection in a time where you probably felt very alone?
I didn't necessarily feel alone or in need of a connection. For years, it just the whole topics. It's just such a. Well, I was talking to a friend of mine in Cleveland last night or yesterday afternoon, and it's just, she used the word web. It's just such a complex web, that sometimes I just don't know what part of it to address, and it's better to just stay silent. So no, I didn't feel isolated, didn't feel alone. It was just more frustration at the way the conversation went. Some well-meaning person in a leadership position points out a goal of more representation. There's a little buzz in the room, and that buzz was sort of killed by that one person saying, "Where are they?" And we're funnily enough, the three of us were sitting in the back of the room, which is a little bit really odd. And I was silent because I just couldn't. I wasn't going to go there. And this other person said, "We're right here." And this stunned 1 minute of silence afterwards. Yeah, I didn't have a personal alienation from that. It was just like, yeah, glad she said it.
This is thank you both for sharing and your questions back and forth. I feel like I learn a lot. You're very good at sort of holding space for each other and asking good questions. And I just wanted to throw in that sort of, I recognize from that person who's like, "Where are they?" There's this kind of white panic, this like I want to do good white panic, and um, I can recognize some of that energy in myself, like, oh my God, this is so clear and it's so evident that we need to do better. And why aren't we doing better at that? And so I just really feel like just encouraging everyone to sort of move beyond that. And it's sort of in our one of our earlier conversations, we talked about this, and um, there's this sort of like, oh my God, what can I do? And I feel like what's being asked is to listen and have deeper conversations. And so I think there's this reactivity is what I feel like I hear in that story, and unfortunately how it affected you. But that's something as white people I think we could learn from, in sort of like when that anxiety comes out, it's time to sort of stop and listen and deepen. And I just wanted to throw that out as something to learn from, and something that I'm learning in myself.
The tricky part always seems to be that there's this vague uh, uh, this vague power in the ether, this vague force in the ether that is somehow related to a patriarchal heterogamy, um, that continues to go unquestioned. And maybe that is one of the skillful ways to open a conversation, to start with questioning what is familiar and has been questioned for a long time, since the time when we're given the right to vote, and then moving from, perhaps I'm just thinking out loud, moving from safe ground or safer ground to a little bit more unspoken ground?
Well, I feel like you just, in a very personal, beautiful way, just sort of articulated an experience of sort of the centrality of whiteness, of this white supremacy. Like there's this standard. I feel like Resma Menachem talks about this really quite strongly. There's a standard that somehow is this invisible presence that is everything is compared against, and decentralizing that is the work. And thank you for I feel like when you share, Eugene, it's very personal and not intellectual, and not, I mean, you are very intellectual, but it's not abstract is what I mean, and this sort of embodiment of this experience that there's this invisible oppressive force. And I think for me as a white person to really recognize that more and more, the way perhaps I swim more comfortably in that and don't even see it.
Catherine, now we're talking about this. I had a question for you. Oh, no, over the course of your life, I imagine you've had some of these conversations more difficult than others. Like, how do you feel like your personality helps you shape these conversations? Like you mentioned, like you're able to speak from a place of vulnerability, and when you do, that helps the conversation be a little bit more productive. So, is this something that you've developed over time, or is it something that's more just your natural personality?
I think having um I think really having a sitting practice helped me just be with myself and then start to be with other people more. I think I was actually very shy, and it's been a long progression. In fact, I remember with mm, there's some embarrassment, but sort of like now it's sort of knowing, like I, as a very young person, God, I was very young, I went to some anti-racist group. I don't know if I was like 20 or something like that, where there was a black woman leading it, and she was like, I'm just, this was like the 80s or early 90s. She's like, I'm just so sick of white people not owning up to their own stuff. And at that phase, I couldn't see, in my young mind at that time, it was still other people, and mostly men, who I thought were the bad guys. I didn't see my own privilege at that time, and I was pretty kind of cut off from my own, mm, yeah, shadow, or whatever we want to call it. So I think it's really been an evolution of sitting with myself and getting to know myself. And the practice of a formal meditation practice was quite helpful, and also a view that encourages you to turn towards and not look away, which again, my very German Irish Midwestern upbringing was like, oh, not looking at that, not touching that. So I think it's been a lot of work, and I think it's still work. I think my personality is, I like things nice, and I like people to agree, and uh, I just keep trying to widen that zone of vulnerability and discomfort. Um, and then also there's confidence within that. Like it's like, oh, this is actually good and liberating. It's not just all painful, and I'm liberating parts of myself while being willing to have more conversations, and uh, letting more information in, and kind of listening more without trying to like prove I'm on the good side, like listening and then looking within too. Yeah.
No, that was great. Yeah, I was just wanting to get, I was just hoping to get, just an impression of, um, how you approach these issues. And yeah, you answered that very, 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 it had a lot of impact.
So I want to talk a little bit about power. This friend of mine in Cleveland was sharing a story about she's very adamant now about the unproven safety of certain hair products, relaxers, and things like that. And she told me this story that she went to an Asian hairdresser a number of about 10 years ago, and she usually has her hair relaxed by a black hairdresser. But she gets this towel thrown over her face, and then when the towel slipped a little bit, she saw that her hairdresser, the Asian hairdresser, was all covered with goggles and masks. And she asked her, "Why are you doing that?" And she says, "Oh, very dangerous, poisonous fumes." And she, for her entire life, had never realized that this could be harmful to her internal organs. And there's never been any major scientific studies on this. And she pointed out to me that power has two sides to it. Power has two edges to it, like a sword. And on the one hand, while there is incredible merit in empowering white people to be able to initiate conversation and have deep conversations about this complex web that I don't think any of us in our generation will be able to see a fruition to. Maybe we will. But she pointed out to me that she did some research, and that 80% of um, uh, hair products are purchased by African American women in the United States, and that in of itself is a huge source of power that could be harnessed to make them safer, to make products safer, or anything in between. I'm not a person who does a lot of hair dressing type things, and I don't have the hair that needs. I have cousins who have hair that they want to have somehow treated or altered. But anyway, her point was that there is power in certain minority groups, and I was really shocked at the number that she said. 80% of hair products are purchased by African American women, and it was absolutely shocking. And it reminded me of the 5 years I lived in the Philippines, where you would go down an entire aisle of a grocery store or drugstore, and all of the products were were skin whitening products made by the major manufacturers. And it was just, I mean, I just teared up that that had to be part of the uh, Filipino experience, due to generational um, desire to be wider than you actually are. So what I'm talking about are a couple different things, but the general thing is that power is a two-edged sword.
Yeah, that's a very you kind of to break your question up. The first portion about the economic power of Black women, of African American women, um, and the relationship to the beauty standards that oftentimes power the requirement to buy relaxers to straighten their hair, and then the various moisturizers or hair care products to compensate for the damage the relaxer does to the hair. And um, yes, it's complex and a lot of issues. On one hand, if somehow Black women were able to uh, confront these hair care companies to invest, with a very firm commitment to creating relaxers or other hair treatment that was a lot gentler to the scalp and to hair, that would really have a change to that would benefit literally the bodies of, oh, excuse me, of Black women, and as we've seen over the course of American history, that um, and I believe Resman talks about this, that it's the Black body that is the subject of, excuse me, the object that white supremacy is projected onto. Um, but then kind of on a similar note, there is the the beauty standard that straight hair, that a lot of Black women feel pressured to emulate. I mean, recently there's been an emphasis towards natural hair, afros or braids or other protective type hairstyles. Um, and you may see stories in the news where you, you know uh, Black female employees are let go because they have dreadlocks or because they have braids, and there's this resistance, or this, to put it in another word, fear or anxiety about um, bold expressions of Blackness. And I think the the sense of power that is embedded, kind of this ether that you're talking about, Eugene, that it's very resistant to anything that challenges it, whether you're talking about patriarchy um, or other gender issues, or in this case, the expression, that the right for Black women to truly express themselves. So yeah, it's a very complex issue, uh, but yeah, it seems that in the end, America respects dollars, and if somehow the companies respected the buying power of African American women, that may be something that would make a significant impact on that.
This is maybe not so much a content related response, but that was such a powerful image you shared of your friend. She's got the warm towel on her face, and then it slips away, and you see, like why didn't you see something that's toxic, like why didn't people tell it? This is like what everybody's doing, this is what I'm supposed to do, and then it's like this revelation that it's toxic and it's bad for you, and it just feels very I don't know, it's a very potent metaphor in terms of looking and seeing, and like we're all kind of what you were saying earlier, Eugene, about this kind of, we're swimming in the sea of of these unseen forces that are shaping us and uh, doing harm.
So this has been a very, very varied and rich conversation. I want to direct it towards its end with um, uh, the fact that today, supposedly, the announcement of the sentencing of Derek Chauvin will be announced. Whether one cares about it or not, or whether the emphasis should be on the Floyd family or whatnot, it will come up in conversation. And I'm wondering how people are feeling about responding to either uninformed um, comments or uninformed observations that are either solicited or unsolicited, or how in certain instances we may feel empowered to bring people towards the greater point that this is just one small um, crest in the overall battle against racism. The overemphasis on whatever sentence is passed today will aggravate that idea that one little crest is going to make a dent in um, uh, several hundred years of generations of systemic racism. So I was wondering how everybody thought they might, with the tools they now have, respond to other people's reactions, maybe not on social media, but maybe in casual conversation?
I guess, this whole, well, it's not quite on the level of OJ. This was what happened to George Floyd was an international incident, but the same sense of polarization about the true meaning of the trial, that what happened to George Floyd is not an a moment of a hateful action by one cop, that to many people, by POC, this is the representation of a system that has been wildly unchecked and um, is drunk with power. And so this moment will be, its validity will be known by the level of the sentencing. And I think it's important to explain, well, not to explain necessarily, but to protect ourselves from internalizing the dismissive comments from other people who feel that this is a one-time thing, and he'll be brought to justice, but things are fine with the police force. And I just hope that enough people decide to, throughout the course of this trial, or throughout the last year, where we've been having a racial reckoning in various levels, that enough people begin to pay attention and investigate themselves, and also the nature of the system that allowed what the murder of George Floyd to take place.
Reflecting on this conversation, or this prompt, so I feel like I'll mostly be in a bubble, a bubble of people who perhaps will agree that this is a drop in the bucket and there's more work to do, and yet still there's a sense of kind of moving on, like, oh, phew, kind of that at least that's been taken care of. So I'm just really reflecting right now in terms of deepening the conversation and thinking about my strategies for deepening it without sort of knowing that I have the answers to this complex web of injustice. So I feel I feel like I don't have an answer, but I feel encouraged, and I'm thinking there's one in our earlier discussion I brought up. There's one relationship I have where I kind of know there will be a less favorable um, view of the situation. There's a power differential in that relationship, and really just going to encourage myself to stay present and speak about history. I mean, it's very clear that, like, kind of police were created in many ways to capture, enslaved people who were running away for their freedom, and a lot of that has continued. So, how to have these conversations? Um, yeah, I think it's really about having courage and holding the line, kind of, in the conversation. Um, I guess I'm thinking two things, and response to the prompt that Eugene mentioned about the Derek Chauvin trial. One is that I don't expect that I'll run into very many people who will sort of be very vocal about just thinking it's a drop in the bucket and it's not a big deal and he's been punished and now we can move on. Most people that I come in contact with are really looking at the small steps, like at least like there were police and his chief who testified against him, and that they see in there are small changes that will hopefully continue, and it's just not one verdict. So I'm thinking for myself, well, how do I deepen those conversations and dig a little deeper for myself and those other people, and continue to sort of fight more more consistently against injustice. And then I have one person in my life who may be more more antagonistic to sort of the whole social justice movement, and I think I'm gonna just really try to be present and sort of stand a certain ground and see if I can have that conversation without sort of backing down and being kind of conciliatory. So, oh well, this is maybe something to add to. Chris was asking me sort of like what if there's something in my personality in terms of how I talk to people. So I do, like, I have friends who are more can kind of just straight up say stuff, like, and let it just like be like a bomb in the relationship or the situation. And I'm like, oh my God, that is not my style. So I think within this, and maybe this goes back with what we were talking earlier, is like trying to find my way through these conversations, not by taking on a different style and a different personality, but by expanding the abilities that I have, which are around connection and communication and empathy. How do I use that and deepen and challenge? So those are some thoughts that I'm left with at this moment.
And I want to just point out a tool that Chris uses a little bit better than I do, which is asking the question first before going into the conversation. He often does that with me, and I'm sure within his circles. But sometimes, and I referred to this earlier, sometimes starting with what is already known or what is already comfortable, and extending that into the uncharted territories could sound like, tell me more what you mean about that, or yeah, can you tell me why you stated it in the way that you stated it. I'd like to know more about how you're feeling, because in the end it's not going to be solved in one conversation. And I think the invitation to understand the other person's viewpoint, wherever it comes from, by an open-ended question, can lead to at least a healthier relationship that maybe one day can go deeper. So again, I think Chris does that better than I do. I have other talents.
That's very helpful. I think I think in some ways I try to do that energetically and having a little bit more facility of like being aware of what I'm doing. Well, tell me more. And then that creates space to, sometimes I find it very challenging with this one person who I have a power differential in our relationship. So that advice to ask questions and listen, whereas before I'm like, oh my God, he shouldn't be this way, and this creates that kind of panic in me that we were talking about is not that useful, so yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, I think no matter what your conversation is with anyone about either Der Chauvin or any other point in our culture that has a racial, a conflict of values on race. I think just being authentic to who you are is what carries the most value. So, Catherine, in your sense, just holding space and um, coming from a place of vulnerability, I think that's best. And for Eugene to, to speak directly from your heart, that's great too. I think just as long as we're willing to be, active listeners, I think that's, that's a great place to start.
So I want to thank everybody for this very rich conversation. I hope our listeners got something out of it or enjoyed it at the very least. On this particular day, I want to remember a speech that Dr. Martin Luther King gave at the National Cathedral in 1969. That's the source of a very often used quote of his. And the speech was entitled "Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution." And the famous line that we benefit from that speech is, "We shall overcome, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." So whoever it was that said perseverance and patience, we're speaking the nonviolent resistance language of Dr. King. So thank you very much, everybody, for this conversation. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Any future news about or other podcasts and videos, you'll be notified. And thank you, everybody, for your courage to look.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Chris. Appreciated being part of the conversation.